Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to take a real quick look at the Scramble for Africa with a focus on the Berlin Conference, which set all of this up. So in some previous lessons, we're learning about the history of imperialism, and the map here shows that Europeans had a lot of contact with African nations and peoples throughout the 15, 16, and 1700s and into the 1800s. But you can see on the map that most of those contact areas are located along the coast or along major rivers. And these are not really totally controlled areas either. They're not going to be the colonies that we're going to see developing under this new imperialism. But Europeans and Africans had traded and existed and communicated and did things together for a very, very long time. But again, with this new imperialism, that map is going to change significantly. In a previous lesson, we talked about the advantages Europeans are going to develop, which is going to allow them to expand beyond the coast and penetrate the interior portions of Africa. Vaccines to help protect from diseases, steamships which allowed for faster and better transportation, especially up those rivers, and of course advanced weaponry like the Maxim gun and other forms of weapons that are modern compared to the weapons of African armies. And that eventually, without going through all the details, right, the African continent will look very much like this by 1914, divided up amongst European powers. But we're going to go back to sort of the start of all of this. Where did all this come from? Why are Europeans going to be coming down to the continent of Africa? Obviously, the vast amount of resources is extraordinarily tempting. These are valuable resources that European industrialized nations wish to get their hands on. Right? So how were they able to come down here and to collect all of this land, gain it under their control, and not any one of them really fight over it? How did they avoid fighting with each other while they swooped down to control this continent? Well, that's going to happen through an event called the Berlin Conference, which takes place between 1884 and 1885. The conference is a way for these European powers to meet together with the goal of making sure that they are going to avoid conflict with one another and colonize Africa as quickly as possible. The Berlin Conference is going to be hosted by the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. He is a guy who for many years worked tirelessly to make sure that Germany, who is kind of centralized in Europe, surrounded by all these potential enemies, maintained this idea of a balance of power in Europe. So it is in his best interest, as well as other European countries' interest, to avoid fighting each other. So 14 countries are going to attend this conference. Those leading nations, of course, France, England, Germany, and Portugal. Now, they are sitting down and discussing the future of Africa in terms of European colonization. And of course, they're not going to invite any African leaders or representatives from any nation in Africa to Berlin to participate in this conference, right? We have this very strong racism, the social Darwinism that's driving the thinking of these European powers, and they literally are going to sit down and determine the future of African people without any African voices present to probably counter these issues, right? The conference is going to focus on what they identified as the 3 C's of commerce, business and trade, Christianity, and civilization. So at the conference, they are going to speak about how they're going to go and colonize these places and take control of these places for the benefit of the African people. Again, that's very much a mixed message, as we talk about in future lessons about colonization and the impact on people and cultures and language and religion and things like that. Now, they are going to go down there and abolish slavery, but again, that's another sort of mixed message, as slavery is one thing and forced labor is also very similar to slavery, right? European powers want to make sure that there is free trade along the Congo River and the Niger River. They want countries to be able to navigate with those rivers and not have one country claim them and shut another country out. It is here at the Berlin Conference that King Leopold's ownership of the Congo will be created. Much more on that in an upcoming lesson. All European countries, of course, promise not to sell firearms or alcohol to native African people. And they talk about what's called the principle of effectivity. They want an effective occupation. They talk about the rules and the logistics of how you are going to claim these lands. Again, all things we don't really need to get into specifically. We just need to understand that it's at this conference that European leaders are negotiating with each other, reaching compromises so that they can go down there, get these resources, and avoid conflict with one another. Right? We're not talking about avoiding conflict with African people. That's obviously going to happen. People are going to be have their lands taken over, so of course there's going to be resistance. But the purpose of the conference is to avoid European countries fighting other European countries. So the plans to avoid war and conflict between other industrialized nations. Bismarck, again, looking for this balance of power, making sure everybody has sort of enough to keep them happy, making sure people aren't going to get too greedy, to want to snatch up land from somebody else. We want to squash all that. And of course, one big thing to remember from this conference is that the African people are not considered when we are sitting down and dividing up their continent. Right? And literally, great political cartoon as Bismarck here leading this conference, pointing to this African cake and slicing it up, providing the Europeans seated around the table with a slice of this African cake. So by the time the conference is over and by the time all this plays out, we see a much different African continent. Large areas in blue controlled by the French, areas of red by the British, the Belgians with the Congo, the Spanish, the Italians along some of the coastal areas, the Portuguese, the Germans. There's only really two areas of Africa that are left uncolonized, Liberia on the western coast and Ethiopia, which was a Christian nation, hence not being colonized by Europeans, over on the eastern coast of Africa. And again, when dividing all of these lands into different territories and colonies, we are not going to take into account the ethnicities and languages and cultures and religions of African people who are then scattered amongst multiple territories, multiple nations, which is going to have long-term effects. Okay, we're not even going to get into that in this lesson. Driving all these things, don't forget, is a very strong racist attitude driven by beliefs in pseudosciences like eugenics, which we'll talk more about later, but also social Darwinism. That's the term we're using to describe the attitude of these Europeans who believe that they are more advanced than other non-European people. From the French Chamber of Deputies, Jules Ferry, in 1884, speaking at the conference, he said, "Gentlemen, we must speak more loudly and more honestly. We must say openly that indeed the higher races have a right over the lower races. I repeat that the superior races have a right because they have a duty. They have the duty to civilize the inferior races. In the history of earlier centuries, these duties, gentlemen, have often been misunderstood. And certainly, when the Spanish soldiers and explorers introduced slavery into Central America, they did not fulfill their duty as men of a higher race. But in our time, I maintain that European nations acquit themselves with generosity, with grandeur, and with the sincerity of this superior civilizing duty." Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, right? But again, these people are talking about how it's their responsibility to civilize people that they deem to be uncivilized. That is their responsibility. They're not going to bring slavery like the Spanish did. That was a bad thing the Spanish did. We are going to go there and we are going to abolish slavery, and we are going to go there and we are going to be generous, and we are going to be sincere, and we are going to help civilize these people. We'll learn more about what this civilization looks like in some future lessons. Now, in Africa, as well as some other places, we're also going to see different forms of colonial control. So once the rules are kind of set for the Berlin Conference, we're going to see European countries begin to go down and establish colonies, right? And as well as things called protectorates and some other things. So as we look at imperialism as a whole, we just want to understand there are a few different forms of control. A colony is a country or territory that is directly controlled by a more powerful nation. In Africa, Somaliland will be an example of a colony. Somaliland was a French colony. therefore coming under direct control of the French government. A protectorate, on the other hand, is a country with its own government but is more influenced by another nation. So in British East Africa, for example, we have a protectorate in place where you can kind of keep your own people in charge, but they're going to come under the influence of the British. Kenya was a British protectorate, right? They're able to keep their own people in charge, but of course they have to listen to the British government. Later on, we're going to talk more about China. China is going to be not colonized, but rather come under the influence of a sphere of influence. Now, this is where a foreign country like an England or a France would go to China, and they would have control over business. They would have control over trade and resources. They wouldn't necessarily control the government per se, but it was more about controlling trade, resources, and business in a specific area. A lot of countries are going to descend upon China and establish spheres of influence there. You can look a little bit more closely at the map if you want to pause the video. And then also economic imperialism. When we get to look at India, India will be under the economic imperialism of the British East India Company from 1600 to 1858. So in India, we literally have a business, a company, running an entire nation under their economic control. That's from 1600 to 1858, and then things will change, but we'll learn that a little bit later. So just a little big picture, right? Indirect control is some ways that Europeans are going to control colonies. That means that local leaders usually get to stay in charge. There is some self-rule within these colonies, but not much. The goal of the Europeans is, though, to develop future leaders. We want to raise people up to support our colony and support our control of them in places like Nigeria, India, or Burma, or in the U.S. colonies on the Pacific Islands. Lots of indirect control is being used. Direct control is where the foreign nation comes in and brings in their own leaders and rulers and government official. There is no longer any self-rule for the native people. The goal of a direct colony and direct control would be assimilation, right? We want to transform those people. Again, something we'll talk more about later. Europeans bring in their style of government, their style of society. So in places like Vietnam or Somaliland or in Angola, you're going to see a lot more hands-on direct control by European colonizers. So some takeaways from this lesson as we continue to dive into imperialism, which is a huge topic, right? Lots of things to learn about and lots of very complex things happening. But to keep it really simple, European nations wanted to get access to the resources in Africa as well as the market in Africa. There's millions of people there who can buy our stuff. Technology, because of industrialization, gave Europeans huge advantages. We've done that in previous lessons. The Berlin Conference is probably the biggest takeaway from this lesson, as European countries sat down and worked together to divide and conquer Africa, avoiding war with each other. That's going to come later. And African and ethnic culture groups, as well as resources, are going to be divided across the continent, which is going to have long-lasting effects. Social Darwinism is always within imperialism, as it's a main driving force, as Europeans believed that they were superior and therefore had a right to go about and do all these things. And within this big picture of imperialism, there are many different forms of control, some of them direct control, where there's a lot of hands-on rule, or indirect control where local and native people are allowed to have some form of autonomy, but not much. So that's our lesson looking at the Berlin Conference as it applies to Africa and continuing to move forward in our study of imperialism. I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I hope you learned something.